He ruined my life to have me. I pretended to love him, to destroy him. Hello. Welcome to this journey through the halls of the English aristocracy, where secrets whisper between velvet curtains and vengeance is woven with ancient patience. This is the story of Lady Vivien Blackwell, who lost everything but never lost herself. A narrative about how deep wounds teach the most precious lessons about love, forgiveness, and rebuilding. Where are you joining us from? Let us know in the comments. And if this story touches your heart, subscribe and leave a like. Your support allows me to continue bringing narratives about the complexity of the human soul. Take a deep breath. Imagine rain-drenched roses, old oak floors, the whisper of silks in dark corridors. Are you ready? Let's begin. Year: 1847. City: London, England. Victorian era. The rain fell on London like tears the sky itself could no longer contain. It was one of those nights when even the stones seemed to weep, when the wind carried with it not just the smell of wet earth, but also omens that the wise knew how to interpret and the foolish ignored. In the Blackwell mansion, the candles flickered, as if sensing the end. Lady Vivien, then only 17, stood before the library window, watching the carriages arrive one after another. Black carriages, solemn, carrying not visitors, but executioners, dressed in silk and medals. Her father, Lord Edmund Blackwell, a man of immaculate reputation and dedicated service to the crown, waited in the main hall. His hands, which Vivien had always known to be firm when holding the reins of horses or signing important documents, trembled imperceptibly. Her mother, Lady Catherine, sat on the embroidered divan she herself had chosen in happier times, with the erect posture that decades of aristocratic training had molded, but with eyes that no longer saw a future. The accusations were grave: treason against the crown, conspiracy against the interests of the realm, forgery of royal documents, words as heavy as lead, pronounced with the coldness of one who condemns without flinching. There was no tangible proof, only the testimonies of men whose names were whispered with reverence in the highest circles: influential merchants, nobles of ancient lineage, a duke whose word was worth more than the truth, Duke Richard Lancaster. Vivien pronounced the name mentally, feeling it turn bitter on her tongue, even unspoken. He had been present at the summary trial, observing from afar, with those grey eyes that seemed capable of piercing walls and souls. Young, powerful, inscrutable, a man who at 28 already controlled more land and influence than many could in a lifetime. That night, as the rain turned the garden into a black mirror, the Blackwell family was stripped of everything. Their titles were revoked, their properties confiscated, their reputation destroyed with the precision of one shattering fine crystal, knowing it could never be mended. Vivien watched her father being taken away, not in chains, for there was still a veneer of civility in those proceedings, but in a dark carriage that swallowed him as if it were his own mortality, made of wood and iron. Her mother, her heart already weakened by years of conventions and social expectations, did not withstand the sorrow. In 3 months, she was being buried in the modest cemetery where those without titles or glories now rested. Vivien was left alone. At 18, without family, without a home, without a name that wasn't pronounced with disdain or pity. She took refuge where she could, with a distant aunt who took her in more out of obligation than love, in a small house on the outskirts of London, where the city's noise arrived muffled and the solitude was as dense as the morning fog. There, between walls that were not hers and silences that weighed like stones, Vivien learned something that books do not teach and masters cannot lecture on: that pain, when well tended, can transform into something harder than diamond. She did not cry. She did not allow herself to crumble. She just observed, memorized, stored every detail of that injustice like one archive's precious documents. The name Richard Lancaster repeated in her mind like a dark mantra. He had been the orchestrator, the invisible hand that moved all the pieces on that cruel board. But why? What reason would a powerful duke have to destroy a family that had never done him harm? The answer, Vivien suspected, was hidden somewhere between the shadows and whispers of aristocratic salons, and she swore to herself, before the cracked mirror of her borrowed room, that one day she would discover the truth, and when she found it, she would bring justice. Not with violence, for that would be stooping to the level of those who destroyed her, but with the most powerful weapon of all, the truth exposed to the unforgiving light of day. The years dragged on like wounds that never fully heal, only forming fragile scabs over the raw flesh. 7 years had passed since the fall of House Blackwell. Vivien, now 25, had transformed into a woman of restrained beauty and striking presence. She was no longer the frightened girl who had watched her world crumble, but someone who had learned to walk among ruins with her head held high. She lived modestly, giving piano and French lessons to the daughters of merchants who aspired to the elegance of the nobility without possessing their blood. It was a job that kept her on the margins of the society that had once been hers, close enough to feel the nostalgia, distant enough to remember the humiliation. It was on an autumn afternoon, as the leaves danced in golden swirls through the streets of London, that he reappeared in her life. The message arrived on high-quality cream paper, sealed with the Lancaster crest. Vivien recognized it immediately, and her hands trembled as she held the envelope, not from fear, but from something deeper and more dangerous. The anticipation of one who has long awaited the moment to confront her tormentor. The note was brief, written in elegant, firm handwriting. Lady Vivien Blackwell, I request your presence at my residence at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. There is a matter of mutual interest to discuss. Duke Richard Lancaster. She almost tore up the paper. Almost. But something stopped her. Curiosity, perhaps, or the feeling that a twist of fate was finally offering her an opportunity she could not waste. The next day she wore her best dress, a dark blue that highlighted her amber-colored eyes, and made her way to the Lancaster mansion. The residence was imposing, with perfectly manicured gardens and a facade that exuded power and tradition. Every brick, every window, every architectural detail screamed, "Here lives someone who has never known a fall." She was received by a stern butler, who led her through corridors decorated with paintings of severe-looking ancestors to a private drawing room, where a fireplace crackled softly and the aroma of fine brandy hung in the air. Richard Lancaster stood by the window, his back to her, observing the garden. When he turned, Vivien felt the impact of his presence like a silent punch. He was older, naturally, with a few lines around his eyes, but this only intensified the aura of authority that emanated from him. His dark hair impeccably combed, his suit of a perfect cut that only the best tailors could achieve. His eyes, those grey eyes she remembered from the night of her ruin, fixed on her with a disturbing intensity. "Lady Vivien," he said, and his voice was softer than she expected, almost gentle. "Thank you for coming." "I could hardly refuse an invitation from the Duke Lancaster," she replied, keeping her tone neutral, polished, revealing nothing of the storm raging inside her. He indicated an armchair, and she sat, aware of her every movement, of every glance he cast in her direction. There was something in those eyes, an intensity that went beyond mere social courtesy, something that made her feel simultaneously seen and dissected. "I will be direct, as I imagine you do not appreciate beating around the bush," he began, sitting across from her. "I have a proposal to make. A proposal that may seem shocking at first glance, but which carries mutual benefits." Vivien remained silent, waiting. "I require an heir," he said, without looking away. "And you, Lady Vivien, require the restoration of your name and social position. I propose an agreement. Give me a son, and I will publicly commit to restoring the reputation of House Blackwell. I will admit that the accusations against your father were based on erroneous information. Your name will be cleared. Your family honored posthumously." The silence that followed was as thick as black velvet. Vivien felt the blood pulsing in her temples, felt the floor sway beneath her feet, but she remained motionless, her face a mask of aristocratic composure. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice controlled. "Why not choose one of the dozens of young women in high society who would give anything to become the Duchess of Lancaster?" He smiled, a small, almost sad smile. "Because you, Lady Vivien, are different. You know loss, you know dignity in adversity, and—" he hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Because you are the only one who has never looked at me with ambition in your eyes." It was a lie, of course, or not the whole truth. Vivien knew it instinctively. There was something more, something unsaid, something hidden between the lines of that grey gaze that assessed her with disconcerting intensity. "I need to think," she said, standing up. "Naturally, but do not take too long. Time is a luxury neither of us possesses in abundance." Vivien left the mansion with her mind reeling. The proposal was absurd, outrageous, almost obscene, and yet there was an opportunity there. An opportunity to enter the world of the man who had destroyed her family, to get close to him, to discover his secrets. That night, lying in her narrow bed, staring at the cracked ceiling of her modest room, Vivien made a decision. She would accept the proposal, but not for him, not for the title or the social restoration. She would accept because, finally, fate was offering her the chance to know her enemy up close, and by knowing him, she could destroy him just as he had destroyed her family. Vengeance, after all, was a dish best savored slowly, with each spoonful planned, each flavor identified. And she, Lady Vivien Blackwell, was a woman who had learned to be patient. 3 days after the proposal, Vivien returned to the Lancaster mansion with her answer. She accepted. The words left her lips with firmness, without apparent hesitation, although inside her mind was working furiously, weaving plans and possibilities like a spider weaves its web. The wedding preparations were quick, almost indecently rushed by Victorian society standards. But Richard Lancaster was a man accustomed to bending conventions to his will, and what he desired happened with the speed of one who commands, not asks. It was during this period of preparation, as Vivien was being measured for wedding gowns and receiving protocol visits from distant Lancaster relatives, that she began to investigate. Discreetly, like one gathering crumbs without anyone noticing, she gathered information. She discovered that Richard possessed a vast library, a collection of documents and correspondence dating back decades. She also discovered that he spent long hours in his private study, a sanctuary where not even the oldest servants were allowed to enter without express invitation. And it was there one afternoon when he was away on business that Vivien found what she was looking for. The key was hidden in a book of poetry, ironically a volume of Lord Byron that spoke of love and betrayal. Vivien opened the study with trembling hands, aware that every second in there was a calculated risk. The documents were organized with impressive meticulousness. Contracts, letters, financial records, and then, in a locked drawer that she had to force with a hairpin, she found a folder marked with the Blackwell crest. Her heart pounded as she opened it. There it was. Every step of the meticulously planned conspiracy, forged letters that looked as if they had been written by her father, bribed witnesses whose payments were recorded in a separate ledger, documents forged with terrifying perfection, and, most revealing of all, a letter in Richard's own hand written years before her family's fall, addressed to an associate. House Blackwell must fall, not out of hate, but necessity. Edmund Blackwell will never consent to my proximity to his daughter, and social conventions prevent a direct approach. Only by stripping her of everything can I have her completely in my power. It is cruel, I acknowledge, but love, I have discovered, can make men cruel when the hope of reciprocity seems impossible. Vivien read and reread those words until they burned into her retina like a branding iron. Everything had been premeditated. Her family was not destroyed for political or financial reasons. It was destroyed because Richard Lancaster desired her with a sick obsession that led him to orchestrate the ruin of innocent people just to have her vulnerable, dependent, at his mercy. The revelation was like being plunged into ice water. First, the paralyzing shock, then the cutting clarity. She was not just a victim of fate or political intrigue. She was the object of an obsession that had cost her parents' lives, her childhood, her innocence. She mentally photographed every document, every word, every detail. Then, carefully, she put everything back in its exact place, locked the drawer, returned the key to the Byron book, and left the study like a ghost, leaving no trace. That night, at the dinner preceding the wedding, Vivien watched Richard with new eyes. She saw now, not just the powerful Duke, but the obsessed man. She noticed the way he looked at her, with an intensity that went beyond carnal desire, something deeper and more disturbing. Possessiveness, yes, but also a poorly hidden vulnerability, as if she were simultaneously his trophy and his weakness. When he extended his hand to help her sit, she accepted it, allowing his fingers to envelop hers. Outwardly, she was the obedient bride, the woman who accepted her fate with dignity. Inwardly, she was a warrior, sharpening her weapons. "You look beautiful tonight," he said, and there was a sincerity in his voice that disconcerted her. "Thank you, my lord," she replied, maintaining the formal, distant tone. During the meal, as they chatted about trivialities, Vivien made her final decision. She would not just accept this marriage, she would live it fully, fulfilling her part of the agreement. She would become pregnant, give him the heir he so desired. But in the meantime, she would gather every proof of his crimes, document every lie, build an irrefutable case against him. And when she finally revealed everything, when she confronted Richard Lancaster with the evidence of his betrayal and manipulation, it wouldn't just be about revenge, it would be about justice, about exposing the truth and restoring not only the Blackwell name, but the very dignity he had tried to steal. The wedding would happen. The heir would come. But Richard Lancaster, in his arrogance, did not understand that by bringing Vivien close, by placing her inside his world, he was handing his own weapons to the only person capable of using them against him. The huntress was about to enter the predator's den, and this time she would be the one to determine the end of the story. The wedding took place on a winter morning, when the mist still covered the gardens and light filtered through the stained glass windows like uncertain promises. The ceremony was discreet, limited to a few select guests, as Richard preferred it that way, and Vivien had no one to invite. She walked down the aisle of the private Lancaster chapel, wearing an ivory silk dress that glided over her body like cold water. There was no father to give her away, no mother to adjust her veil. Just her and the ghosts of all she had lost, accompanying her invisibly silent witnesses to this act that was simultaneously surrender and a declaration of war. Richard waited at the altar, impeccable in his black suit, and when their eyes met, Vivien saw something in them that disturbed her. Not triumph, but something akin to gratitude, almost reverence, as if she were granting him an invaluable gift instead of fulfilling a business agreement disguised as matrimony. The vicar's words echoed off the ancient walls. In joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health. Empty promises, Vivien thought, beautiful words about feelings that didn't exist. But when Richard held her hand to place the ring, his skin was strangely warm, and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers so discreet that only she noticed. "I do," she said, "because it was expected, because it was part of the plan." "I do," he replied, and his voice carried a weight that the words alone could not convey. Married life brought changes. Vivien became the Duchess of Lancaster, a title that carried power and responsibility. Society, always ready to forget scandals when convenient, opened the doors of the most refined salons to her once again, some out of curiosity, others out of hypocrisy. But they opened. Richard fulfilled part of his promise almost immediately. In a carefully crafted public statement, he admitted that there had been misunderstandings in the investigations that led to the fall of House Blackwell. It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough for her family's name to stop being synonymous with treason. It was, Vivien acknowledged, a skilled maneuver. It restored her reputation without admitting his own criminal guilt. But the most disconcerting thing was Richard's behavior in their private life. He didn't force her into anything. He didn't demand immediate physical intimacy. Instead, he courted her as if they were still in their engagement period, with small, considerate gestures. Flowers left in her room, books chosen specifically to her taste, long conversations about art and literature during dinners. "You read Bronte?" he had asked one night, finding her in the library with a copy of Jane Eyre. "I read everything," she had replied, maintaining the distant courtesy she had established as her armor. "And what do you think of the story? Of a love built on secrets?" Vivien had stared at him, looking for ulterior motives in that question. "I think secrets are fragile foundations for any construction." He smiled sadly. "I agree, and yet we all build on them." It was conversations like these that unsettled her. Moments when Richard seemed almost human, vulnerable, capable of introspection and regret. But Vivien could not, would not, be fooled by appearances. She knew the truth. She had seen the documents. She knew what he had done. Meanwhile, she continued her secret investigation. She discovered that Richard maintained regular correspondence with several members of the House of Lords, some of the same ones who had testified against her father. She copied every letter she could access when he was absent. She memorized conversations overheard partially through ajar doors. She was building, brick by brick, the edifice of evidence she would one day use to confront him. It was 3 months into the marriage before physical intimacy was consummated. It happened on a spring night, when the scent of wisteria drifted through the open window and the moon cast silver patterns on the sheets. Richard was gentle, careful, attentive in a way Vivien had not expected, and for the first time she felt a crack in her armor of ice. 2 weeks later, she discovered she was pregnant. The news was received by Richard with a joy so genuine it was baffling. He held her hands, kissed her fingers, and there were tears in the corners of those grey eyes. "You have given me something no fortune could buy," he had said. And Vivien, feeling the life growing inside her, felt for the first time something she had not planned to feel: conflict. Because this child would not be just hers or his. It would be both of theirs. And the vengeance she so carefully planned would not only affect Richard, but also this innocent child. Still, she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Justice, she repeated to herself, not vengeance. It was about truth, not about personal destruction. At 5 months pregnant, Vivien had gathered enough evidence to destroy Richard Lancaster completely. Testimonies from bribed servants, copies of forged documents, ledgers with compromising payments, letters proving premeditation. She kept everything in a secret safe at her old aunt's house, far from the Lancaster mansion, far from Richard's eyes. And as her belly grew with the life it held, her determination grew as well. The confrontation was approaching, and Vivien, feeling the baby's movements inside her, knew that soon she would have to make the most difficult choice of her life. Summer arrived with its golden heat, turning the Lancaster gardens into a sea of colors and fragrances. Vivien, now 7 months pregnant, moved through the mansion's rooms with the clumsy grace of one carrying not just a life, but also the weight of decisions not yet made. Richard had transformed, not drastically, not obviously, but Vivien, an attentive observer, noticed, in the little things, in the way he looked at her during breakfast, not with the possessive intensity of the early days, but with something softer, more concerned, in the way he insisted she rest, that she not tire herself, that she accept all the pampering he offered. He cancelled important engagements to dine with her. He read to her at night, poetry mostly, his deep voice turning verses by Wordsworth and Shelley into melodies that almost made her forget who he was, what he had done. "You seem different," she had commented one afternoon, finding him in the garden, observing the rose bushes he had ordered planted especially for her, knowing they were her favorites. "Different how?" he had asked, turning to her. "More human." He laughed, but it was a joyless laugh. "So you saw me as less than human then? I didn't know how to see you." It was the most honest conversation they had ever had. They sat under a pergola covered in climbing roses, and Richard was silent for a long time before speaking. "I have done terrible things," he said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on his hands. "Things I cannot undo, choices that haunt me every night. I believed the ends justified the means, that if I got what I desired, the rest would resolve itself. But it only became more complicated, harder to bear." Vivien felt her heart race. Was this a confession, a plea for forgiveness, or just empty words from a man who knew how to manipulate emotions as well as he manipulated facts? "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, cautious. "Because you deserve to know that I regret it, not the result because you are here and our child is on the way, but the methods, the lies, the pain I caused." He finally looked at her, and Vivien saw something that shook her. Genuine remorse. Not the feigned guilt of someone trying to manipulate, but the real pain of one who carries the weight of his choices and knows there is no easy redemption. "You fell in love with me," she said, not as a question but as a statement. "A long time ago, at a ball, years before everything happened. You were 16 wearing a sea-green dress and you were laughing at something your friend said. It was the laugh that captured me. It was so genuine, so free, so different from everything I knew in this world of appearances." Vivien remembered that ball. It had been one of the last happy moments before the fall, and Richard Lancaster had been there, watching her from afar, and she hadn't even noticed. "And so you decided to destroy my family to have me?" "Not immediately. First I tried the proper channels. I spoke to your father, expressed my interest. He refused categorically, said you deserved someone better, someone less complicated. He knew things about me, about shady dealings, questionable alliances. He was right, of course, but I couldn't accept it." He paused, swallowing with difficulty. "So I began to plan. I reasoned that if your family fell, if you were left with no options, perhaps you would accept me." It was cruel logic, born of desperation disguised as determination. "And it worked," Vivien said, bitter. "It worked, but not as I imagined. I thought it would be simple. A business agreement, a marriage of convenience, an heir. I didn't expect," he hesitated. "I didn't expect to fall in love with you again, with the woman you became, strong, resilient, magnificent, in your silent dignity." Vivien felt torn. Part of her wanted to scream, to accuse him, to confront him with all the evidence she had gathered. Another part, smaller but impossible to ignore, felt something dangerously close to compassion for this broken man admitting his own monstrosity. "That doesn't change what you did," she said finally. "It doesn't. I don't expect forgiveness, Vivien. I know I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know the truth, all of it." That night Vivien lay awake for hours, feeling the baby move inside her, a constant reminder that her decisions would not affect only her and Richard. There was an innocent life in the middle, a child who deserved parents, a home, not the ruins of a justified but devastating vengeance. For the first time since accepting Richard's proposal, Vivien began to question her own plan, not because he didn't deserve consequences, but because she was beginning to understand something too complex to fit into simple categories of right and wrong, that people could be simultaneously monsters and victims of their own weaknesses, that love could coexist with unforgivable acts, that redemption, though difficult, might not be impossible. It was a dangerous thought, and Vivien knew it, but she could no longer ignore it. It was on a grey autumn afternoon, when Vivien was 7.5 months pregnant, that everything came to light. She found Richard in his study, that private sanctuary where it had all begun months ago when she discovered the proof of his betrayal. He was sitting at his desk, surrounded by documents, and he looked tired in a way that went beyond the physical. It was the weariness of someone who has carried burdens too heavy for too long. "We need to talk," Vivien said, closing the door behind her. He looked up at her, and something in his expression changed. Maybe it was the tone of her voice, maybe the determination in her eyes, but he understood immediately that this would not be an ordinary conversation. "I know," she said, getting straight to the point. "I know everything from the beginning." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard became completely still, as if every muscle in his body had turned to stone at once. "I found the documents," Vivien continued, her voice surprisingly calm. "Months ago. The false letters, the payments to witnesses, the ledger, everything. I know you deliberately orchestrated the destruction of my family, not for politics, not for money, but because you wanted me and wouldn't take no for an answer." Richard closed his eyes slowly, as if the weight of years of secrets was finally crushing him. When he opened them again, there was a resignation in them that was almost peace. "How long have you known?" "Since before I accepted your agreement." He processed this for a moment, and then a painful understanding crossed his face. "You accepted knowing. You planned to destroy me from the beginning. I planned to get justice. For my family, for my father who died with his name stained, for my mother who could not withstand the shame, for myself who lost everything." Richard stood up, but did not approach her. He just stood there, a man suddenly stripped of all his defenses. "Then do it," he said, his voice hoarse. "Do what you came to do. Expose me. Destroy me. I deserve it. God knows I deserve it." It was that complete surrender that broke something inside Vivien. She had expected confrontation, denial, perhaps even threats. She had not expected this total acceptance of his own judgment. "Why?" she asked, and for the first time her voice trembled. "Why do all that? There were 1,000 ways to— I don't know, caught me, wait, try again. Why destroy?" Richard ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of desperation for him. "Because I was young, arrogant, and used to bending the world to my will. Because my father raised me to believe that men like us don't ask, we take. Because I was obsessed to the point of insanity, and obsession clouds judgment. Because—" he paused, swallowing. "Because I was too selfish to understand that love is not won through destruction." He walked to the window, his back to her. "I spent years convincing myself that the ends justified the means, that if I managed to have you by my side, we would find happiness eventually, and everything I had done would be forgotten, justified. It was only when you were already here, when I truly began to know who you are, that I understood the magnitude of what I did, and what I lost by doing it." "What did you lose?" Vivien repeated, incredulous. "The possibility of being genuinely loved by you," he said simply. "You are here, carrying my child, bearing my name. But you look at me with eyes that hold an abyss between us, an abyss that I dug myself, and that no confession or regret can fill." Vivien felt tears burning her eyes. Tears of anger, of sadness, of an emotional confusion that left her exhausted. She placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby move as if it too were reacting to the tension in the room. "What do you expect from me now?" she asked. Richard turned to her, and there was something in his eyes she had never seen before. Freedom in surrender. "Nothing. I expect nothing. You have all the proof. You can do what you think is justice. Expose me publicly. See me imprisoned. Destroy me as I destroyed your family. I will not fight. I will not defend myself. Only—" he looked at her belly. "Only I ask that you think of our child. He is not to blame for his father's sins." This was it then, the moment she had planned for months. Richard was completely at her mercy, confessing everything, ready to accept the consequences. The proof was stored, safe. She could destroy him with a word, with a visit to the authorities, with a public statement. And yet standing there, Vivien understood something that would change everything. That complete revenge would mean depriving her son of a father, would mean dragging an innocent child into the center of a public scandal, would mean turning herself, in a way, into the same type of person Richard had been years ago when he destroyed her family. "I need to think," she said finally. "I need to decide what to do with all this." Richard nodded, not arguing. "Whatever you decide, I will accept. You deserve justice, Vivien, and I deserve any punishment you deem appropriate." Vivien left that study carrying more than just a life in her womb. She carried the weight of a decision that would determine all of their futures. The days that followed the confrontation were filled with a dense, expectant silence. Richard did not try to dissuade her, made no additional promises, did not try to manipulate her. He simply continued his life, maintaining the respectful distance Vivien had established, awaiting her judgment like a condemned man awaits his sentence. Vivien spent hours in the library, staring blankly at the books, her mind a whirlwind of contradictory thoughts. She had everything she needed to destroy him. Justice was within her grasp. Her father would be avenged, her mother honored posthumously, and the world would know the truth about Richard Lancaster. But at what cost? Her son grew inside her, each movement a reminder that her decisions transcended her own pain. This child deserved a family, not wreckage. Deserved parents, not the perpetual war between vengeance and guilt. "Are you well, milady?" asked Mrs. Hensworth, the housekeeper Vivien had learned to trust over these months. "I'm just thinking." "About the Duke?" Vivien looked surprised. The housekeeper smiled gently. "I have worked here for 20 years. I saw the boy become a man. I saw his choices, his transformations, and I can say I have never seen him as he has been these past few weeks. How has he been? Tormented, but also hopeful, in a strange way, like someone who finally glimpses the possibility of redemption, even knowing he may not deserve it." "He doesn't deserve it," Vivien said, but the words lacked conviction. "Perhaps not. But the baby you carry deserves a chance. And the Duke, despite everything, loves this child more than anything he has ever possessed. I've seen it in his eyes." It was these words that planted the seed of the decision Vivien would eventually make. A week after the confrontation, she asked Richard to meet her in the garden, in the same place where he had confessed months ago that he had fallen in love with her at a ball when she was 16. The afternoon was clear, with the October sun painting the leaves gold and amber. Richard arrived punctually, looking older than his 35 years, the weight of guilt visible in every line on his face. "I have made my decision," Vivien said without preamble. He nodded, bracing for the blow. "You will confess publicly. Not everything, but enough. You will admit that the accusations against my father were based on fabricated evidence, that there was a conspiracy in which you participated. You will restore to the Blackwell name not just its reputation, but also confiscated properties." Richard agreed immediately. "I will do it. What else?" "You will be exiled." This made him pause. "Exiled? Voluntarily? You will remove yourself from London, from society, from your position. You will live apart as punishment for your crimes, but—" She paused, placing a hand on her belly. "But you will be allowed to see your son. Not as a father present daily, but in agreed-upon visits. This child does not deserve to grow up without a father, but he also does not deserve to grow up surrounded by lies. And you? What will happen to you? I will raise our son here. I will restore the Blackwell name. I will live with the truth, even if it is not completely public. And you," she stared at him firmly, "you will live with the consequences of your choices. Not imprisoned, as that would expose our family to public scandal, but isolated, without power, without influence. It will be your punishment, but also your chance for redemption." Richard processed this slowly, and then something surprising happened. He began to cry. Not dramatic sobs, but silent tears that streamed down his face as he looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and pain. "It is more than I deserved," he said. "Much more. You could destroy me completely, and you would be within your rights. Instead, you give me a chance to know my son, a chance to, perhaps one day, deserve forgiveness. I am not doing this for you," Vivien clarified, but her voice was softer. "I am doing it for my son, and for the woman I do not want to become. Complete vengeance would turn me into the same monster you were. This is my form of justice. Not complete, not satisfying as I imagined, but more human." They stood there under the autumn sky, Two imperfect human beings trying to build something decent upon the ruins of horrible mistakes. "Thank you," Richard said finally, "for allowing me to be part of his life, or hers, for not denying me this." Vivien did not reply. She simply turned and walked back to the mansion, carrying within her not just a new life, but also a new understanding, that forgiveness is not forgetting, justice does not have to be destruction, and that sometimes being human means accepting that nothing is simple, not even retribution. Richard Lancaster's public confession caused a scandal that reverberated through all the salons of London's aristocracy. In a carefully worded statement, before authorities and select witnesses, he admitted his participation in a conspiracy that resulted in the false accusation of House Blackwell. He did not reveal all the details, as that would implicate other powerful nobles and could trigger consequences that would harm Vivien and the child. But he said enough. That evidence was manipulated, testimonies were bought, and that Edmund Blackwell had died with his name unjustly stained. "I carry this guilt as my cross," he had declared, his voice echoing through the hall, "and I accept the consequences of my actions. House Blackwell deserves not just words of apology, but concrete actions of reparation." He returned properties, established a fund in Vivien's name, and publicly renounced several of his titles and positions. It was a carefully calculated public immolation to repair the damage without completely annihilating his own family. Society reacted with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. Some acclaimed his courage in confessing. Others whispered that he only did it because he was found out, that there was no true nobility in confessing when exposed. Vivien heard these whispers and didn't care which interpretation prevailed. What mattered was that her father's name was cleared. 2 weeks after the confession, Richard left London. Not in complete disgrace, as he still maintained rural properties and financial resources, but his political power had evaporated, his influence in aristocratic circles drastically diminished. He settled on an estate in the hills of Yorkshire, far from the capital, far from judging eyes. Vivien remained in the Lancaster mansion in London, now indisputably hers as part of the reparation agreement. She prepared the baby's room, filling it with light and soft colours, a stark contrast to the shadows that had dominated her life for so long. On a rainy day in December, 3 weeks after Richard's voluntary exile, the contractions began. The labour was long and difficult, as Vivien had feared, but when she finally held in her arms a baby boy with wide eyes and clenched fists, she felt something she had not expected. Hope. Pure, simple, uncontaminated by all the complexity that had preceded this moment. "He's perfect," murmured the midwife. "He's free," Vivien whispered, kissing the baby's soft forehead. "Free from all our mistakes." She named the boy Edmund, after her father, and Lancaster, because it was his father's name. Edmund Lancaster would be raised knowing the truth about his lineage, but also about redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility of being better than those who came before. 3 days after the birth, Richard arrived. Vivien had allowed him to come, as agreed. He entered the nursery with the reverence of one entering sacred territory, and when he saw his son for the first time, his face transformed completely. "May I?" he asked, extending trembling hands. Vivien placed Edmund in Richard's arms, watching as the exiled duke looked at his son with a mixture of love, admiration, and a pain so deep it was almost physical. "He looks like you," Richard murmured, gently tracing the outline of the tiny face. "He has your eyes," Vivien replied, and it was true. Those grey eyes, so piercing in Richard, were incredibly soft in the baby. "Thank you," Richard said, without taking his eyes off his son, "for giving me this, for not depriving me of this moment. I didn't deserve it, but you—" "I didn't do it for you," Vivien reminded him, but her voice lacked its previous hardness. "I did it for him. Every child deserves to know their parents." Richard stayed for only 2 hours, holding Edmund, talking softly to him, making silent promises that Vivien didn't need to hear to understand. When he left, there was a determination in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "I will be better," he had said at the door. "For him. I will prove that I can be the father he deserves, even if I never get to be the man you deserved." In the months that followed, Richard visited once a month. He arrived discreetly, spent a day with Edmund, and left before nightfall. He didn't try to prolong his stay, didn't ask for more than he had been granted. He just cherished every second with his son, slowly building a relationship that, though limited, was genuine. Vivien watched these visits with complex feelings. She saw Richard transform with his son in ways he never had with her. She saw a man trying to be better, not for personal gain, but out of genuine love. And slowly, very slowly, something in her began to soften. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, perhaps never completely, but it was the beginning of something, the possibility of peaceful coexistence, perhaps even eventual mutual understanding. Time, she was beginning to realize, was the only real medicine for wounds so deep. 4 years passed like leaves carried by the wind, each season bringing subtle but significant changes. Edmund grew up vigorous and curious, with his mother's sharp intelligence and his father's quiet determination. At 4, he was already asking questions that surprised Vivien with their depth. Why does Papa live far away? Why do people whisper when we walk by? Is Grandpa Edmund in heaven with Grandma Catherine? Vivien answered with age-appropriate honesty, never lying but also not overburdening the child with truths too heavy for such small shoulders. Your father made mistakes before you were born, serious mistakes. Now he is learning to be better, and you see him because every child deserves to know their parents, even when they aren't perfect. Nobody is perfect, Mama, Edmund had said with the seriousness of a miniature philosopher. You always say that, and it's true, my love. Richard, for his part, had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The forced exile in Yorkshire, far from the power games and intrigues of London, had given him something he never had, time for reflection and space for genuine growth. He had dedicated himself to charitable works, opening schools for poor children in nearby villages, renovating precarious houses, establishing agricultural cooperatives, not as a noble distributing arms from the height of his superiority, but as someone working alongside the people, getting his hands dirty, learning their names, their stories. I am trying to do something good, he had written in one of his monthly letters to Vivien. She didn't reply, but she read them all. Not as atonement, for I know there are not enough works to make up for what I did, but because Edmund needs a father who is more than an example of moral failure. I want him to grow up knowing that people can change, that horrible mistakes don't have to define us forever. The monthly visits continued, now more cheerful. Edmund eagerly awaited his father's arrival, running into his arms when the carriage appeared at the entrance. Richard brought simple gifts, books, seeds to plant together in the garden, once a puppy that Vivien allowed to stay after seeing the joy on her son's face. During these visits, Vivien watched from a distance. She saw the care with which Richard treated Edmund, the infinite patience, the unconditional love. She also saw that Richard never tried to turn the son against her, never spoke ill of her, never questioned her decisions as a mother. There was genuine respect there, born not from fear of losing access to his son, but from recognition that she deserved that respect. In the 3rd year of his exile, Richard published a small book of essays on personal redemption and moral responsibility. He didn't identify himself as the author initially, using a pseudonym, but the quality of the text and the depth of the reflections eventually revealed his identity. The book caused a moderate sensation, some accusing him of trying to clean up his image, others finding in it a moving sincerity. He really is trying, commented Lady Ashford, one of the few friends Vivien had made in the years after her name was restored. Don't you think? I'm beginning to believe so, Vivien admitted, and it was the first time she had said it out loud. In the 4th year, something more fundamental changed. Edmund fell ill with a high fever that lasted a week, gravely worrying the doctors. Richard, upon being informed, rode from Yorkshire to London in record time, arriving covered in mud and exhausted. May I see him? He had asked, without even cleaning up. Vivien led him to the room where Edmund lay feverish, and Richard spent the next 3 days there, alternating with her at their son's bedside, cooling his forehead with damp cloths, holding his small hand, murmuring stories and lullabies. It was during the early morning of the 3rd day, when the fever finally broke and Edmund was sleeping peacefully, that Vivien and Richard found themselves alone for the first time in years. Sitting in opposite chairs, the soft light of a candle between them, exhaustion had made them vulnerable in ways they wouldn't be when wide awake. Thank you, Vivien had said, for coming, for being here. He is my son. There is nowhere I wouldn't go if he needed me. Silence. Then Vivien said something she didn't even know she felt until the words came out. You've really changed, haven't you? Richard looked at her, surprised. I'm trying. Every day. I don't know if true change is possible for someone like me, but it is possible, Vivien interrupted him. I see it, in how you are with Edmund, in your actions, in the stories I hear about the work in Yorkshire. You are trying to be better, and that means something. Tears glistened in Richard's eyes. You don't know how much it means to hear you say that. It doesn't mean complete forgiveness, Vivien clarified, needing to be honest. I don't know if I can ever completely forgive what you did, but it means acknowledgement of your transformation, of your efforts. Richard nodded, accepting what she offered. Not complete redemption, but recognition that he was no longer the man who had destroyed her family years ago. That night marked a turning point in their relationship. They didn't suddenly become close. There was no dramatic reconciliation, but something softened between them, an acceptance that they were both human, fallible, capable of growth and change. Chapter 10. The Gradual Return. The 5th year after Edmund's birth brought changes that no one could have anticipated. Vivien, who had spent these years not only raising her son but also studying estate management and investments, had turned the restored Blackwell lands into prosperous enterprises. She had established schools for girls, something radical for the time, and literacy programs for rural workers. Her name had become synonymous not only with family redemption, but with social progress. Richard, upon learning of her initiatives, offered to help financially without wanting credit. Edmund needs to see examples of generosity without expectation of return, he wrote. It was Lady Ashford who first suggested the unthinkable. During tea one spring afternoon, with Edmund playing in the garden, she asked cautiously, "Have you never thought of allowing the Duke to return? Not completely, but more present in his son's life." Vivien paused, her cup suspended in mid-air. "Why do you suggest that?" "Because Edmund is beginning to realize that his family situation is unusual. He loves his father, but he notices that other children see their fathers daily. And because," she hesitated, "because perhaps the time has come to consider if the punishment is still justified, given how much the Duke has changed." The idea planted itself in Vivien's mind like a persistent seed. She didn't want to admit it, but she had observed the melancholy in Edmund when his father's carriage departed after each visit. She also observed that Richard, despite accepting the limitations imposed, carried this visible pain in his eyes every time he had to say goodbye to his son. It took her months to make the decision. Months of careful observation during visits, of conversations with Edmund, of evaluating her own heart to see if she was ready for this next step. Finally, in a carefully worded letter, Vivien wrote to Richard, "Lord Lancaster, after long consideration, I would like to propose a change to our current arrangement. Edmund is growing and requires a more constant presence from both parents. I propose that you return to London, not to the main mansion, but to a nearby residence. This will allow you to see Edmund more frequently, perhaps 3 times a week instead of once a month. This is not a complete reconciliation, nor absolute forgiveness. It is simply an acknowledgement that you have demonstrated genuine change and that our son deserves to have his father more present in his life. If you accept, there are conditions. You will maintain an appropriate distance from me, focusing your time and energy on Edmund. You will not attempt to completely restore your former political power. You will continue the charitable work you have begun. I await your response. Lady Vivien Lancaster." Richard's reply arrived a week later, his handwriting visibly trembling. "Vivien, you grant me a gift I never thought I would deserve. I accept all conditions without hesitation. I will return to London not as the man I was, but as the father Edmund deserves, and the man I hope to continue becoming. Your trust, even limited, is more precious to me than any title or power I have ever possessed. Eternally grateful, Richard." The return happened in September. Richard settled in an elegant but modest house, a 15-minute carriage ride from the main mansion. Edmund, when informed, exploded with joy, jumping and shouting with childish enthusiasm. "Papa is going to be close. I'll see him all the time." The first few weeks were strange, a period of adjustment for everyone. Richard came 3 times a week, spending afternoons with Edmund, teaching him to ride, reading with him, playing in the garden. Vivien watched from afar, maintaining the appropriate distance but noticing the details. Richard's infinite patience with childish questions, the way he truly listened to his son, the genuine love evident in every gesture. Occasionally, out of practical necessity, Vivien and Richard would talk about issues related to Edmund. These conversations, initially stiff and formal, gradually became more natural. They were not friends, certainly not a reconciled couple, but they were cooperative parents, united by the shared love for their son. In November of that year, Edmund asked something they both knew would eventually come. Why don't you live together like other boys, Mommy and Daddy? Vivien and Richard exchanged glances, a moment of silent communication about how to respond. Because sometimes adults make mistakes so big, Vivien began carefully, that things can't go back to being exactly as they were before. But mistakes can be forgiven, Edmund insisted, with the relentless logic of a child. You always say that. And they can, Richard intervened gently. But forgiveness doesn't mean everything goes back to being the same. It means we choose to move forward differently, better. That's confusing, Edmund complained. It is, Vivien agreed, smiling sadly, but you'll understand when you're older. That conversation stayed with Vivien for days. Edmund was right in his childish simplicity. Mistakes could be forgiven. The question was she ready to take that final step? Richard had proven change. He had proven dedication. He had proven he was no longer the man who destroyed her family. But complete forgiveness, true reconciliation, would mean opening herself up to vulnerability again. And Vivien didn't know if she was brave enough for that. Not yet. Winter arrived harshly that year, covering London with snow that silenced the world like well-kept secrets. It was during this winter that the ghosts of the past returned to haunt in an unexpected way. Edmund, now 6, had begun to ask deeper questions about his family's history. He asked about the grandfather he never knew, about why the Blackwell family had lost everything, about the details Vivien had always been careful not to fully reveal. Mama, why did Grandpa Edmund go away? People say he did bad things, but you say he was good. Who is right? Vivien felt her heart tighten. She knew this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it so soon. Your grandfather was a good man who was unjustly accused of bad things, she explained, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes people make mistakes and accuse those who are innocent. Like Papa? Did he make mistakes? The question was simple, but it carried immense weight. Vivien looked at her son, those grey eyes so much like Richard's, waiting for an answer with the trust of one who believes their mother always tells the truth. Yes, she said finally. Your father made very serious mistakes before you were born. Mistakes that hurt many people, including our family. But he's better now. He is. He has changed. That's why we see him. Why he's back in London. Edmund processed this with the seriousness that characterized important moments for him. So very bad mistakes can be forgiven if the person really changes. They can, with time. And hard work. That conversation repeated in Vivien's mind when, weeks later, she received an unexpected visit. Lord Pemberton, one of the lords who had testified against her father years ago. He was an old man now, bent by the weight of years and apparently of conscience. He asked to see her, and Vivien, curious, allowed it. Lady Lancaster, he began, not knowing she still preferred Lady Blackwell in personal contexts. I have come because I cannot die without clearing certain things. Vivien listened as he confessed how Richard Lancaster had pressured him to testify against her father, how he had accepted out of fear of his own transgressions being exposed, how guilt had been eating at him for years. I do not expect forgiveness, he concluded, his hands trembling. I only came to tell the truth. Your father was innocent, completely, and I contributed to his ruin out of cowardice. After he left, Vivien sat for a long time, processing. It was another piece of the puzzle, another confirmation of what she already knew, but hearing it directly from someone who had participated in the conspiracy made it all more real, more painful. When Richard came to see Edmund that afternoon, Vivien pulled him into a private conversation. Lord Pemberton visited me, she said directly. He confessed everything. How you pressured him, threatened him, manipulated him. Richard turned pale. Vivien, I'm not going to confront you about this again. We already know the truth. But I need you to understand something. Forgiving is not forgetting. I can acknowledge your change. I can allow you to be part of Edmund's life. I can even eventually find peace with what happened. But I will never completely forget. I can't. I don't expect you to forget, Richard said, his voice hoarse. And I won't ask you to. I just hope you know that if I could go back, if I could undo, but you can't. None of us can. We can only decide who we will be from now on. It was a moment of brutal honesty between them, without filters, and strangely, it brought more clarity than any previous conversation. That night, Vivien wrote in her private diary something she had never admitted out loud. I am beginning to realize that forgiveness is not a destination one arrives at, but a path one walks. Every day is a choice, to carry hatred or to choose peace. Richard did not deserve easy forgiveness, and he will not receive it, But Edmund deserves parents who do not live trapped in the past. I deserve a life that is not defined solely by vengeance or pain. Perhaps it's time to let go, not for Richard, but for myself. Winter eventually gave way to spring, and with it came subtle changes. Richard and Vivien began to talk about more than just Edmund. Casual conversations about books, about their mutual charitable projects, about the transformations in Victorian society. They weren't intimate, not close, but the rigid hostility that had characterized their first years had softened into something more like mutual respect and occasionally even cautious camaraderie. Edmund flourished with the increased attention from both parents. His laughter filled the gardens, his curiosity led him on constant adventures, his natural kindness reflected the best of both of them without carrying their scars. And Vivien, watching her son play with his father on a sunny afternoon, felt for the first time in years something akin to contentment, not complete happiness, not an absence of pain, but acceptance of what was, of what is, and of what could be. The autumn of the 7th year brought a test that no one had anticipated, a trial that would finally determine if Richard's transformation was genuine or merely a well-executed performance. A financial scandal rocked London. A group of nobles was being investigated for fraud involving railway investments that had ruined dozens of middle-class families. Richard Lancaster's name was mentioned on the fringes of the investigation, not as a main participant but as someone potentially aware of relevant information. Authorities requested his testimony. Richard could easily deflect attention, protect old allies who still owed him favors, use his knowledge as a bargaining chip to restore political influence. It was exactly the kind of situation where the old Richard would have manipulated, deceived, protected his own interests. Vivien watched, waiting. This would be the definitive proof. Richard testified completely, honestly, without omitting anything. He revealed private conversations, exposed schemes he had knowledge of, implicated powerful lords who considered him an ally. His brutal honesty helped authorities build cases that eventually led to the restitution of stolen funds from ruined families. But this came at a cost. The few political allies Richard still had turned their backs on him. Doors that had begun to reopen slammed shut again. He was called a traitor by those he exposed, naive by those who advised him to protect himself. Vivien received visits from several society ladies, all with the same veiled message. What a pity the Duke didn't know how to protect his interests better. A man in his position should have more discretion. But Vivien understood the true nature of what Richard had done. He had chosen honesty over convenience, justice over self-protection. He had chosen to be the man Edmund needed him to be, not the man society expected. One evening, after Edmund was asleep, Vivien invited Richard for a private conversation for the first time in years. They met in the library, that same place where so many truths had been revealed. "You could have protected yourself," Vivien said without preamble. "You could have given partial information, protected allies, regained political influence. Why didn't you?" Richard sat down, looking tired but at peace. "Because Edmund will grow up asking who his father is, and when he asks, I want to be able to say I am someone who chose to do the right thing, even when the wrong thing was easier. I want him to see in me an example of integrity, not convenience. This will cost you any possibility of fully returning to politics. I know, and I don't care. I've discovered, Vivien, that everything that truly matters fits in a small house in London and visits with a 6-year-old boy who asks me hard questions about heroes and villains." Vivien sat across from him, studying him with renewed attention. "You really have changed. Completely." "I hope so. Because the man I was would have sacrificed 100 families to gain a political advantage. The man I am trying to be can no longer look at himself in the mirror if he does that." Silence. Then Vivien did something she hadn't done in 7 years. She extended her hand and touched Richard's. Not a romantic gesture, but one of acknowledgement, of genuine respect. "Thank you," she said, "for proving that people really can change. For proving that Edmund can believe in redemption not as an abstract concept, but as something he witnessed in his own father." Richard held her hand gently, aware of the gesture's meaning. "And thank you for giving me the chance to change, for not destroying me when you could have, for allowing me to be Edmund's father, for showing me that forgiveness, even partial, even slow, is possible." It was a moment of genuine truce between two former enemies who had finally become something different. Not reconciled lovers, perhaps never that, but two people who shared a complex history, a beloved son, and a respect earned through years of hard work. In the weeks that followed Richard's testimony, something changed in the dynamic between them. They conversed more freely. Occasionally they laughed together at one of Edmund's antics. They consulted each other on important decisions related to their son with genuine consideration for each other's opinions. Lady Ashford noticed, "You two seem different, lighter in a way." "We are," Vivien admitted. "I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it's as if we've finally stopped being prisoners of our own past." "Is that reconciliation?" "Not in the traditional sense, but it is peace. And perhaps for us, peace is the best form of love we can achieve." Edmund, with the sharp intuition of children, certainly noticed the change. His parents no longer avoided each other. Sometimes they even played with him together. They were not a traditional family, but they were a functional family built on more honest foundations than many apparently perfect ones. And Vivien, lying in her bed one night, realized something surprising. She was happy, not in the simple, carefree way of the youth she had lost, but in the complex and deeply earned way of one who has walked through fire and survived stronger. Her family was restored, her son was thriving, and the man who had once destroyed her had paradoxically become one of the pillars of the life she had rebuilt. Life, she reflected, was strangely and wonderfully more complex than simple stories of heroes and villains could capture. It was on a golden summer afternoon when Edmund had turned 8 that the moment of truth finally arrived. Edmund had organized, with the help of the housekeeper, a small celebration for his birthday. He had invited children from neighboring families, but what he really wanted, he confessed shyly, was a party with Mommy and Daddy together, without you staying on different sides of the garden. The childish petition, spoken with that disarming honesty of children, struck Vivien deeply. She hadn't realized that Edmund noticed how she and Richard, despite their progress, still maintained a careful physical distance, still orbited each other without truly meeting. The party took place on a sunny Saturday. Children ran through the garden laughing. There were sweets and games, music and joy, and Vivien found herself, for the first time in years, sitting next to Richard on a bench, watching their son play. "He's happy," Richard commented. "He is, because we are finally more than cooperative parents. We are something like a family." Richard turned to her, surprised by the admission. "Is that what we are?" Vivien thought carefully before answering. "We are not a traditional family, perhaps we never will be, but we are people who care about each other, who have created something good despite horrible beginnings. Isn't that family?" "It is," Richard agreed, moved. "It's more than I ever dreamed I deserved." It was then that Edmund ran up to them, holding a flower he had picked. "For both of you," he announced solemnly, handing them the flower. "Because today you are really together." The simplicity of the gesture, the pure hope in her son's eyes, broke something that still resisted in Vivien. She looked at Richard, saw the man he had become through years of hard work, saw the dedicated father, saw someone who carried his scars but was not defined only by them. "Richard," she said, using his first name for the first time in years, "I need to say something." He waited, tense. "I forgive you. Completely." Absolute silence. Even the children playing in the background seemed to fade, as if the world was holding its breath. "You forgive me?" Richard repeated, as if he couldn't believe the words. "I forgive you. Not because you easily deserved it. Not because what you did became less terrible with the passing of years. But because—" she paused, searching for words for complex feelings. "Because forgiveness isn't about you. It's about me. About choosing not to live trapped in that pain anymore. About acknowledging that you became someone different, better, and about our son who deserves parents who don't carry hatred." Tears now streamed freely down Richard's face. "Thank you. God, thank you. You don't know. You can't imagine." "I know," Vivien interrupted him gently. "I see it. I see it in how you've changed, in who you've become. I see it in Edmund, how he is better for having you in his life. I see it in myself, how I am more at peace now than I was even in my plans for revenge." Edmund, watching his parents, didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew it was important. He climbed into his mother's lap, then reached out his hands to his father, connecting them physically in a way that rarely happened. "Are we a real family now?" he asked. Vivien and Richard exchanged glances, a silent communication that only years of shared history allow. "We are," Vivien confirmed, in a different way but real. That night after the party, after Edmund was asleep, Vivien and Richard talked more deeply than they had ever talked before. "What does this mean?" Richard asked cautiously. "Your forgiveness. Do I return completely? Do we become A real couple? Vivien considered. Honestly, I don't know. We can't just erase years and pretend we are a traditional couple who fell in love simply. We have to build something new, not rebuild what we never had. Then how do we build? Slowly, with honesty, perhaps by starting to truly know each other, not as victim and culprit, not just as mother and father, but as two people who share a complex history and an uncertain future. I would like that, Richard said softly. I would very much like to know who you really are, Vivien, without the layers of pain and defense that have always been between us. And I would like to know who you are now, not who you were. It was a new beginning, not romantic in the conventional sense, not passionate or dramatic, but genuine. Two people choosing to build something new on foundations of painful honesty and hard-won forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, Richard began to visit not just to see Edmund, but also to talk with Vivien. They had tea together, discussed books, shared stories from their respective childhoods that they had never told before. They learned about each other as people, not as roles they played. Edmund watched, delighted, as his parents laughed together, talked, existed in the same space without tension. Occasionally he would ask, "Is Papa going to live here again?" "Maybe one day," Vivien would answer honestly. "We are figuring out how to be a family. It takes time." "That's okay," Edmund would say with the boundless patience of children who feel secure. "I can wait." It was 3 months after Edmund's birthday that Vivien made the invitation that would change everything. "Do you want to have dinner here tomorrow? Not a visit for Edmund, a dinner with us." As a family, Richard accepted with a gratitude that still moved him to tears easily. The dinner was surprisingly pleasant. Edmund chatted about his classes, his friends, his plans to build a treehouse. Richard and Vivien listened, contributed, laughed, and when Edmund went to sleep they remained in the drawing room, talking late into the night about everything and nothing, discovering that they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. "You know," Vivien said at 2 in the morning, tired but at peace, "I never thought I would get here, that I could sit with you like this, without feeling anger or pain, without feeling the need to protect myself. Neither did I. I thought I would spend the rest of my life paying for my mistakes, and I would be right. But you gave me something unexpected, the chance to live, not just exist in penance." It was a moment of pure truth between them. And when Richard stood up to leave, Vivien did something that surprised them both. She took his hand, pulled him back, and hugged him, not romantically, but with genuine affection, with acknowledgement of all they had been through together. "Thank you," she murmured against his shoulder, "for changing, for becoming someone I can forgive." "Thank you," he replied, hugging her back carefully, as if holding something precious and fragile, "for allowing me to change, for not giving up on the possibility of redemption." When he left that night, they both knew that something fundamental had changed between them, not sudden love, not inflamed passion, but something perhaps deeper, mutual understanding, earned respect, and the foundation upon which something more could perhaps eventually be built. 2 years had passed since that transformative dinner. Edmund, now 10, was growing up strong and bright, a living testament that love, even born from ashes, can blossom into something beautiful. Richard had moved back into the main mansion 6 months earlier, not as a conquest, but as the natural evolution of a family that had finally learned to exist in harmony. He occupied his own room, respecting the boundaries he and Vivien had established together, but he was present at meals, in family decisions, in daily life. Vivien had discovered something surprising in these years, that she could love Richard, not in the innocent way she might have loved at 17 if circumstances had been different, but in a deeper, more real way. A love born from complete knowledge of his flaws and his transformation, a love that did not ignore the past, but chose to build a future despite it. One spring morning, they woke up side by side for the first time, the result of a previous evening where conversations had turned into tentative kisses, and kisses had turned into a careful physical reconnection, full of tenderness and mutual respect. "Are you all right?" Richard had asked, worried he had moved too fast. "I am more than all right," Vivien had answered, honest. "I am happy." Truly, it was a moment of complete peace, something neither of them had believed possible years ago when everything was hatred, pain, and plans for revenge. Edmund, naturally, noticed the changes. "So now you are like other parents?" he had asked with curiosity. "We are parents who learn to love each other differently," Vivien explained, "who made mistakes and learned from them, who had to work very hard to build something good. That's better than normal," Edmund decided with the unexpected wisdom of children, "because you chose it. Normal sometimes is just because." That summer, the family travelled together for the first time, visiting the properties in Yorkshire that Richard had transformed through his charitable projects. Edmund saw his father's work firsthand, met the children in the schools he had established, saw the genuine respect the local people had for him. "Papa is a kind of hero to them," Edmund commented, impressed. "He worked hard to be," Vivien replied, "and he continues to work. Being good isn't something you are once and it's done. It's something you choose to be every day." It was during this trip that Richard took Vivien to a special place, a small cemetery where a monument had been erected in memory of Edmund Blackwell, Vivien's father. Richard had it built years before, with his own funds, a private way of honouring the man he had wronged. Vivien stood before the monument for a long time, silent tears streaming. "Thank you," she finally said to Richard, "for this, for honouring him even when no one knew. He deserved it. And you deserve to know that I never forgot what I did, that I always carried that responsibility." Vivien held his hand. "My father would have liked the man you've become. Not who you were, but who you've become." In the autumn of that year, Vivien announced she was pregnant again. The news was received with pure joy by everyone, but especially by Edmund, who was thrilled with the idea of being an older brother. "I'll teach him everything," he exclaimed. "Or her. I'll teach them to be good and to forgive and everything you taught me." The pregnancy was smooth, and on a mild spring day, a girl was born whom they named Catherine, after Vivien's mother. She was a child with amber eyes like her mother's and dark hair like her father's, and when Vivien held her for the first time, she felt the cycle had finally closed. "She will never know the pain Edmund was born with," Vivien told Richard. "She will grow up in a whole family, with parents who genuinely love each other." "Thanks to you," Richard replied, kissing her forehead, "for believing that redemption was possible, for giving me not one, but infinite chances to prove that people can change." In the years that followed, the Lancaster-Blackwell family, for Vivien never completely abandoned her maiden name, using both as a reminder of where she came from, became known not for past scandals, but for their social work. They established schools together, reformatories for at-risk youth, literacy programs. Vivien wrote a book on forgiveness and redemption that became surprisingly popular. Richard dedicated himself to legal reforms that protected the innocent from false accusations. Edmund grew up to be a young man of exceptional character, studying law with the goal of ensuring no one else suffered as his grandfather had. Catherine grew up bright and compassionate, interested in medicine and in helping the less fortunate. On a wedding anniversary, 10 years after Edmund's birth, and 8 after the true restart of their relationship, Vivien and Richard renewed their vows, this time not out of obligation or agreement, but by genuine choice before Edmund, Catherine, and a few close friends. "I, Vivien Blackwell Lancaster," she said, holding Richard's hands, "choose you, not because I forget the past, but because I choose to build a future. I choose to believe that people can change, that love can be born even from ashes, that families can be built on foundations of painful honesty and hard-won forgiveness." "I, Richard Lancaster," he replied, tears in his eyes, "choose you, and I choose to be worthy of that choice every day. I choose to be the man you deserve, the father our children deserve. I choose to live not in the shadow of who I was, but in the light of who I can be." They were vows deeper than the originals, born from a true understanding of what they were promising. That night, sitting in the garden under the stars, Edmund and Catherine already asleep, Richard and Vivien reflected on the journey that had brought them there. "Do you know what I learned?" Vivien said. "That revenge would have destroyed me as much as it would have destroyed you. That choosing forgiveness wasn't weakness, but the strongest thing I've ever done." "And I learned," Richard replied, "that true love is not possession or obsession. It is respect. It is constant work. It is choosing to be better, because the person you love deserves your best self." They sat in comfortable silence, appreciating the peace they had built together. Peace was not the absence of a painful history, but the choice not to be defined by it. Love was not perfection, but a commitment to mutual growth. Family was not the absence of mistakes, but the ability to forgive them and grow beyond them. The wind brought the scent of roses, the same ones Richard had planted years ago when he was still just hope and guilt. Now they were a symbol of something greater, of new beginnings, of second chances, of how even from the most terrible mistakes something beautiful can be born if there is the courage to change and the grace to forgive. Vivien leaned against Richard, and for the first time since she had met him at a ball years ago, when she was only 16 and the world seemed simple, she felt completely at peace. "I love you," she said, and this time the words were free of any complication, pure and true. "I love you," he replied, and it meant, "Thank you for allowing me to love you. Thank you for believing I could change. Thank you for building this impossible and wonderful family with me." And so, under the starry sky of an English night, the story that began with destruction found its end in reconstruction. A story about how humans are simultaneously capable of the greatest cruelty and the greatest redemption. About how true love is sometimes born, not despite the scars, but through them. A story that Edmund and Catherine would one day tell their own children. About grandparents who chose to be more than their worst choices. About a family built on honesty, forgiveness, and the unwavering belief that no one is beyond redemption if they are truly willing to change. And in the generations to come, the Lancaster Blackwell name would be remembered not for the scandal that marked it, but for the lesson it taught, that the most important chapter of any story is not where it begins or the mistakes it contains, but the conscious choice to write a better ending.